So I welcome all of you on behalf of AEPF for this much awaited webinar. My colleagues will explain more about the purpose and objective, but at this this juncture, we have been trying to explain and also kind of create a critical mass about the whole debate of austerity and what kind of financing social protection, what kind of social security measures we can talk with the social movement and so on. And in that context, we are organizing this webinar on behalf of AEPF. I will not take much time to quickly hand over the floor to my colleague, Farooq Tariq, who will with the whole purpose and also about AEPF, that what is the whole objective of organizing this webinar. Let me just quickly introduce Mr. Tariq. Tariq is a IOC member of AEPF and General Secretary of Pakistan Kisan Rabita Committee. He is also the president of Haq-e-Khalq Party Pakistan. He has a long history of activism for farmers' rights, labor rights, and human rights. So Farooq bhai, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chandan. Welcome all the participants and the panelists. This webinar is organized by Social Justice Cluster of Asia Europe People's Forum, AEPF. AEPF is a platform, is a network of the movements in Asia and Europe. It brings together the social movements of the both continents to the issues which are related to the lives of the ordinary people. So there are 6 clusters functioning at present time of this AEPF, which has been now functioning for over 2 decades. It has a long history of organizing debates, webinars, meetings, and so on. And maybe one of the very unique network internationally, which is functioning without any funding at present time. It continue on a volunteer basis, and I'm thankful to all the colleagues who are spending their lot of time to bring together the activists so they could be introduced to new ideas. Now, I am based in Lahore, and Pakistan is facing one of the worst crises of price hike, and we have seen great austerity measures by the government, not for the rich, but for the ordinary people. So no austerity, that's our main slogan at present time, because of the implementation of new liberal agenda, because of privatization. So we see that climate disaster, debt issue, trade issue. So it's all bring together to one issue, that who is deciding our fate, who is in the government, how they are making the decisions in favor of the rich. Inequalities is on ever increase. So AEPF welcomes you all, and we will hear some of the prominent speakers from here. So I welcome, and Chandan, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for Farooq bhai to explaining about AEPF and also the mandate of Social Justice Cluster on the theme of today's webinar. I invite Francine Mestrom to give a quick introductions about the global charter which AEPF Social Justice Cluster is trying to promote, and also bringing together large part of social movements, and also the whole objective of today's webinar and what Social Justice Cluster is trying to basically build through these discussion and these processes. So let me quickly introduce Ms. Mestrom. She's a convener of AEPF Social Justice Cluster and IOC member of AEPF. She's the founder of Global Network of Global Social Justice and member of the Global Coalition of Global Coalition for Social Protection Floor. Francine, please.
Thank you, Chandan. I will not use much of your time. I just wanted to use my 2 minutes also to wish you all a very warm welcome to this webinar. I think this comes at a very, very timely moment, because the problems are becoming very, very acute and urgent. Things are changing very rapidly in today's world. And I think we may say that indeed neoliberalism is today unraveling, because the sacred principle of free markets and open markets is now put into question. What is not put into question, however, is the austerity that is imposed on people and countries. And that is why I'm so very happy that we have Dr. Isabel Ortiz with us, who has worked a lot on this topic. I just wanted to give one example of the difficulties that we are faced with. 2 weeks ago, The Economist published an article trying to convince us that we have to make a choice between either fighting climate change or promoting social justice. I think that is outrageous, because we do not have to make a choice. We have to do both. And it is outrageous precisely because at this same moment, so many countries are spending more and more on defense and on rearmament. So if there is money for war, there should be money for social justice, and there should be money for fighting climate change. That is the task before us. And I want to add something more, because if we want support, people support for policies to fight climate change, we have to start with social policies, because we have to help people, we have to protect people against all the changes that people will be faced with because of climate change. So I'm very happy we are having this webinar. I would like to thank the speakers who are today with us. I would like to tell them also that we are indeed preparing a campaign for promoting social justice, for linking up with all the other sectors that are linked to them, such as climate change, such as democracy and human rights. And of course, we will work in the context of the charter that we have prepared, that was adopted a couple of years ago, on global social protection rights. And we have now also prepared a manifesto. We will use this for the campaign we will be organizing. And again, I thank you all very, very much for being with us. And I wish you all a very good webinar. I'm sure that we will learn a lot from everything you will have to tell us, so that we can act and react in a better way in the future. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Francine. Now, before we move to the main panel speakers, I just would like to a little bit explain about the logistics. So we'll have three panel speakers, and then subsequently we'll open the floor for question and answer. So requesting all the participants to put their questions in the Q&A section, and we'll pick up those questions and we'll direct to all the panel speakers, and we'll request them to respond, maybe each one of them or maybe kind of consolidated one. So I will request them to decide that how they want to answer. And I also would like to share that my co-moderators got sick at the last moment, Tabitha, and she expressed apology. So at the last moment, we were kind of juggling to organize the moderation and so on. So sincere apologies for inconvenience if there are any. So we can straight away go to the first panel speaker. Let me introduce him, Mr. Rexon Silaban. He was the president of KSBSI as a National Trade Union Center of Indonesia. He's a supervisory board member of Indonesia Employment Social Security Board, and was also part of General Council of International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, and governing body member of ILO. Sir, floor is yours, please.
Hello, everybody. Is it clear?
Yes, 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 sir.
Okay. Yeah. So again, thank you for inviting me to be speaker for 10 minutes. I think I will share during 10 minutes the social protection and some challenge we are facing right now. First, of course, as you know, Indonesia with the 270 million population still facing huge challenge how to cover social protection to all the population. By constitution and by law, the universal social coverage of social protection will be reached 2029. But till now, Indonesia reached 95% for the health social protection, while for the employment social protection, still 30%, and only 5% of them are informal workers yet. In the meantime, majority Indonesian workers are informal workers. There are some why that happened. First, I think Indonesia under pressure by international competition market. So in the last few years, Indonesia lowering their labor protection to suitable to international labor market. And then many people working in the gray area. For instance, like there is the relation, blurring relation, working relation between workers and the employer. They call partnership system. So, for instance, in the government sector, instead of they're working in the fabric or company, so they give material to the workers in the home, and then they are working there without labor protection, wages, social, and then any kind of the labor protection. And then also the growing number of the digital platform workers, when Indonesia referring them to is not workers, but they are independent contractor, make million people excluded from the coverage of social protection only because the definition. So the target to achieve universal social protection 100% in the 2029 will be impossible without changing the law scenario or law definition about the who are workers, who are the employer. The second is also about the existing social security system is only suitable to those workers who have the employer. If they are not employer, have labor relation, so they are not covered by social protection. And in Indonesia law, the workers defined by only two: wage earner, for those who get salary, and the second category is not wages earner, or those who are no have employer. Outside of that, like informal economy or remote workers or even migrant workers, they have to responsible to pay their own dues, and that's make impossible for many of them because they have no availability of resources, income resources to pay continuously. So the good things in Indonesia is 95% already covered in the health social protection. So means has been in some extent to help Indonesian people when they have the problem. But we call here from our trade union, we need to change the scheme of benefit social protection to reduce the barrier or to eliminate all the barrier people to incorporate it to social security. And even we also request to lowering the threshold of social protection so that enabling all people easily to cover by social protection. Government actually in the law has to responsible to pay dues from government contribution to those who work in the vulnerable work. But since the law said it will be covered progressively, so for the employment social security, still only few people get the protection from the government. The third, also you like to propose, we need to clarify this guy's self-employment and issue of misclarification between status of the workers, because status of work is become the key principle to have access social protection. So in that way, we think we have to continue to pressure or to remind the government that social protection is the main function of the government. It's not private or company, because there is now like proposal from the neoliberal group research to request Indonesia to privatize social protection, even though it's still proposing by research. But this is dangerous if we allow the kind of the things to occupy the government point of view. And we need also to ensure resilience of social security to anticipate change of the risks, distribution risks, since there is the new type of risk in terms of ecological risk and cyber security risks. These new risks are not covered by conventional social security. So that's why the demand to change social protection to adapt or adaptive social protection very needed for a new situation of the world. So I stop here and I'm ready for the explanation if needed. Thank you.
Thank you, Silaban. Please stay tuned. I think I'm sure we will have a lot of questions. So before I proceed, I think what you spoke about just now, I think is largely the situation across Asia, where who's the workers and who's not the workers, what category, what threshold. And I think that's a kind of classical legal system, basically divide the working class and the same situation. But we'll be definitely, about the fact which you shared that 90% of the workforce have a health social protection. I think that's the kind of the things which I was also not aware about that. So I think a lot of people would be interested to learn more about that how state is ensuring, and even how the trade union is working to ensuring over 90% people are having social protection on the health question. So
yes.
I think we'll discuss more about that. We'll have more questions, but let me quickly go to our main keynote speaker. Welcome, Isabel, one more time. You have been interacting. Yes, so you have been interacting with the AEPF, and I think you were also there as one of the keynote speaker in the last AEPF, and we heard about your whole larger discourse and your research and everything. And I think this is another opportunity where we'll be hearing more about today's webinar about the whole issues of austerity and the written measures. So for the audience, let me quickly introduce Isabel. She's the Director, Global Social Justice, and also the former Director at ILO and the UNICEF. Ma'am, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. It is a great pleasure to be here with you today and presenting about the End Austerity campaign, very important for these really turbulent times we are living. I have a very unstable connection, so I hope I don't get cut. If I was, you kindly continue with the next speaker. And hopefully I can improve later. Okay, so I have a presentation, and because an image sometimes tells more than 1,000 words, so I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see that now. Does it work? Perfect. So as mentioned, there is an End Austerity campaign. It is relatively new. It started last year, but that does not mean that there have been a huge movement to fight austerity for decades. And involved in this campaign are big organizations like Oxfam, like ActionAid, and Third World Network, as well as very small organizations. And we are welcoming everybody to join. You have here the coordinates. Go to please www.austerity.org. What I'm going to present is you're going to find it on the website, but you please go there and join. It is very important. And why it's important is because of this map. This map, what it shows here in red, is the number of countries that are going to be cutting, or they're already cutting, public spending in terms of GDP. And as you can see, the whole world is on fire. Really, the 85% of the world population is living in countries where there are austerity cuts or austerity reforms, and with negative social impacts, which we're going to explain now. That means, more than 6 billion people are living at the moment suffering for these unnecessary austerity cuts. And if we look at the IMF fiscal projections, it shows that actually this is going to keep increasing over the years, and you can have that in the reports that they are presented here. However, this does not need to be the case. There are alternatives that they are going to present, feasible alternatives to fund all the social justice programs that we want. And but when we were doing this map, which is based on IMF fiscal projections, then we're thinking, so where are the main cuts? So for that, we read hundreds of IMF country reports to understand where are the policy discussions and where are the cuts. And this is where the cuts are. Majority of the cuts are about targeting social protection. That means if your social protection is like that, they're actually going to contract it and reduce it by targeting it only on the poorest and leaving out many people in need of social protection, like persons with disabilities, like older persons, like family benefits and others. Second most normal cut, it is cutting or capping the wage bill. And this means the salaries and the number of civil servants. And if you know, in the majority of countries, the largest number of civil servants are teachers, health workers, and civil servants at the local level. All of them are very important for social justice and social development. And this is the most normal. What you have here on the darker color is developing countries, and what you have in the lighter colors is high-income economies, meaning the whole world is affected. Third most common option is to eliminate subsidies, like fuel subsidies, but also food subsidies at the time that food prices are at record highs. Fourth most common option is to privatize public services or to enter into PPPs with private public sector partnerships. And this is now called, in many reports, reform of state-owned enterprises. And this is very interesting because IMF keeps changing jargon, and as privatization became so unpopular, so now they use this term to reform state-owned enterprises. And we started looking which state-owned enterprises they refer, because that sounds like some old Soviet factories or something. No, they're talking about public transport, water supply, energy. So, companies that are doing very important social services that need to be quality, and the risk of that is that quality will suffer, and then also prices will very likely increase. That's what experience tells us. Fifth most common reform are pension reforms, very important for us here today, and this is generally decreasing benefits of retirees of pensions, as well as doing sustainability reforms. Next reform is labor flexibility reforms. Then it was very interesting to see that since the pandemic, IMF has been advising to waive employers' social security contributions. And this has done as a way to support enterprises. However, by waiving employers' contributions, it means that workers are not getting, this is part of a worker's salary, and it needs to be quickly returned. And otherwise, the sustainability of social security also, will be undermined. And then even some countries are proposing cuts on health expenditure. And on the revenue side, it's interesting to see the majority of the measures are focused on increasing consumption taxes, so VAT, which is a regressive tax, PPPs, and fees for public services. So these are bad news, and they have negative social impacts on citizens, creating a lot of suffering. Now, I want to focus on just one point, and this is how inadequate the targeting social safety nets is as a mitigation mechanism. Now, what we have here is a distribution of world income. This is an earlier study we did, and you have on the very top is the richest 20%, then followed by kind of the second quintile, which will be kind of the middle class, which is shrinking, then the third quintile, and which will be the working class to say, and the two lowest quintiles, the poorest 20 and 20%, are actually below the poverty line. So 40% of the world population is below the $2 a day. Okay, so as you see, the majority of income is in the richest 20% of the richest 20% of the quintiles. Okay, so what they are doing now here, what governments with the support of the IMF are doing is a series of reforms that are actually eroding the income of workers, vulnerable people, as well as the middle class, which is shrinking the majority of countries due to these reforms. They are doing cuts and privatizing public services. They are doing pension and social security reforms, reducing benefits, and wanting that people have more private savings, but only those that will be able to have. They are doing cuts to social assistance or social protection. They're lowering wages, which have been, not growing for decades. They are cutting subsidies, and they are increasing VAT taxes. So all of that really, really undermines the limited income of these middle and working classes. And then to compensate for that, they claim they do this very little green line that you find before, which will be a safety net for a fraction of the poor, because they don't even take the whole amount of the poor. And this is completely insufficient and inadequate as a compensation mechanism. And as a result, what we can expect is that these policies continue, inequality is going to increase even more, poverty will increase also more, and the middle classes and working classes will continue to shrink. Now, the good news is that this does not need to happen, because there are alternatives, as we're going to present. But if these alternatives are not, we expect that we're going to have a significant number of protests and social instability coming. And this comes from another study we did on world protests, studying protests in 101 countries since 2006, prior to the global financial crisis and recession. And as you can see, and this covers different topics from food prices, housing, jobs, wages, labor conditions, land reform, fuel and energy prices, inequality, low living standards, reforms of public services, etc. And as you can see, the number of protests keeps increasing systematically in 101 countries, covering 90% of the world population, up to when the study finishes. And so we can expect that these type of decisions are continue being taken. Instability, social instability, and discontent will continue growing. Now, ultimately, what we need to realize is that these decisions are bad governance. These are decisions. These decisions are taken behind closed doors at the Ministry of Finance by a few technocrats with the advice of the IMF or some of other IFIs, and they are done without public consultation, and they affect the lives of millions of people. This cannot continue. It's bad governance. And we need to ensure that there is national, public, open social dialogue in which we can put the pros and cons of all these different options and then try to pick those that are socially better. And because ultimately these alternatives exist and people are suffering unnecessarily. All this suffering is not needed. And yes, all the programs that are supported by the Asian People's Forum, from free quality healthcare for all, free quality education, affordable housing, war warranty programs, living wages, universal social protection, living pensions, and subsidized public transport. All that can be financed if we look at the alternatives we have. And again, join the End Austerity campaign and help us fight for that. So which are these alternatives? These are 9 options, 9 that exist even in the poorest countries. Now, not all countries will have all the options, but countries have many of the options, and we'll see how it works. These options are not revolutionary. They're actually known by all governments. They are fully endorsed by the international financial organizations and the UN. And they're happening in many countries. We are not suggesting utopic ideas. They're being done today as we're speaking. So what we need is that more countries apply them. The first and most important option is really to increase tax revenues, progressive tax revenues, no VAT on consumption taxes that are regressive, and the poor pay the same as the rich. We need taxes on corporate profits, on financial activities, on wealth, on property, on natural resources, digital services, and many others. And these, they need to be progressive, meaning taxing more those that have the income to ensure that redistribution happen in societies as they used to happen in the past, and stop this wave of inequality that continues increasing. So we have where wealth taxes have been announced in Argentina, Iceland, Spain, taxing windfall profits in the energy sector that made killing profits in recent years. This is happening in Algeria, Angola, Australia, Canada, Kazakhstan, Italy, Mauritania, Mozambique, Norway, Papua New Guinea, Russia, Saudi Arabia, or the UK. And I'm saying all these countries not to be a boring list, is so you realize that this is happening today. So we need to ensure that it happens in more places, more countries, and really gets implemented. Taxing digital services has been announced in Belgium, Canada, France, India, Indonesia, Kenya, New Zealand, Turkey, Tunisia. Financial transaction taxes have worked briefly in some countries like Argentina, Brazil. Brazil financed the expansion of Social Security with a very small tax on financial transactions until a conservative government came and they were removed. Hungary and Spain have just this year announced new taxes to banks' windfall profits. Banks, because of the high interest rates, are making a lot of money too. So, will be logical to tax these windfall profits. And mining, gas, using taxes on mining and gas and other natural resource extraction, we know that this has been giving lot of resources for social development. For instance, Mongolia financed a universal child benefit with a very, very little tax on copper exports that was supported by the UN, and it was a great thing. And so Bolivia has been financing universal pensions for all senior citizens, universal also, just with a tax on gas and petrochemicals. Well, second option, this was taxation, which makes a lot of sense because increasing inequality trends. Second option will be to fight illicit financial flows. And these are illegal. They are simply happening and they must be stopped. And we're talking about money laundering, bribery, tax evasion, trade mispricing, and other financial crimes. So they need to be fought. Third option, very relevant today, that a new report by the UN Secretary General came out on debt. It will be to eliminate or to restructure debt. And we have 5 main options, which include debt relief cancellation, renegotiating debt, and more than 60 countries have renegotiated debt in recent years. Debt swaps or conversions, repudiating debt, or defaulting. In by the way, more than 20 countries have defaulted or repudiated public debt, like Ecuador, Iceland, or Iraq, and used the funds to invest in social programs. Now, ultimately, what we do need is an international debt resolution mechanism, because at the moment, countries have to negotiate one by one with creditors, and that is very difficult. So we need that international debt resolution mechanism very importantly, and there are discussions at the UN. Fourth option, and very important for the discussion here today, it refers to social protection, and that will be increasing social security contributions by a particularly adequate employers' contributions, not to waive them like the IMF and Ministers of Finance are suggesting to support enterprises, but actually to ensure that employers' contributions are adequate, and also by formalizing workers in the informal economy with good, decent contracts that will protect them. And there are good examples in Latin America from that, like in Uruguay, monotax, by which informal workers receive full access to social security, with that requires a government subsidy, you know, and then it will be just a very minor tax paid from employers as a way to entry from the informal sector, those small and medium enterprises. Fifth option, we're talking 5 options now. So you see how many options governments have, will be to reallocate public expenditures, particularly defense expenditures that have, you know, zero social, you know, positive impact, and replacing those with, you know, investments in social sectors and public services. And we have good examples. For instance, Costa Rica or Thailand in the past did use defense expenditure to expand health. So there are good examples there. Then we can tap on fiscal and foreign exchange reserves. For instance, we have cases like Chile, Norway, and there are a number of those. But I would like to point some countries like have dismal the human development indicators, like Timor-Leste. They have a sovereign wealth fund that is putting the money from Timor-Lesteans in you know, in the stock exchange, global stock exchange, like New York, Frankfurt, London, and that has no justification. This is a country with very low human development, and funds from the country should be invested in their people. Then 7th option will be to adopt a more accommodative macroeconomic framework that means some tolerance towards inflation and fiscal deficit. We'll put that at the very end today because inflation levels are high. Then will be to lobby for more aid, but development aid, as you know, unfortunately, is declining. And a 9th, a very important option will be, and that requires international agreement, it will be to try to get more SDRs allocations. This will be the special drawing rights. This is, you know, a mechanism that is have at the IMF, but is very important and not increase with the debt and conditionalities through IMF program. It's simply given to developing countries. Now, what is clear is these alternatives must be discussed in national dialogue. It cannot be just taken by a few technocrats behind closed doors, because then the risk of pressures by, you know, vested interests is much larger. It's necessary to have national dialogue with representative trade unions, federated employers, not just any employer giving an opinion, civil society organizations, and of course, government and parliamentarians and any other relevant stakeholder. So how can countries have to do it? So all countries have the majority of these options, but what countries do is not to pick only one option. They actually pick a bit of all the options. And then that's the clever way. So this year you start and you pick a bit here, a bit from this option, a bit from this option, and a bit from the other. And so your budget, instead of being like so tiny that you cannot fund any public service or any social protection, then you can fund, it becomes larger and you can fund more. Following years, you keep then increasing a bit more in a cautious way. That's how governments generally do it. And if you're more interested in that, you might be interested in an ILO handbook called Fiscal Space for Social Protection, and it's valid for any public service or any other. So again, going back to end austerity, all that is what we're trying to do at the end austerity campaign. Generally, what can you do? What can a citizen do if you are in your country? Well, first you need to identify your government is really cutting public spending. For that, you might check the end austerity website, or best, it will be the IMF website. Then you make yourself heard. I don't need to tell you about that. You demand quality public services, more social protection programs, jobs, quality jobs, etc. Then you need to call for national dialogue, and that is very important. This cannot be decided behind closed doors. We do need, as part of good governance, to decide these options collectively at national level. Then you're going to need to have a rapid and timely assessment of the options. And timely is here the issue. You don't want a big academic report. It can be, you know, a few pages, but you do need to put the options on paper and think if they're positive or negative socially. And then finally, you need to go to this national dialogue and discuss the policies openly and agree options. The key issues agree on. So learn about all the other activities, and there are many more activities proposed in the campaign. There's going to be major action now at the Marrakesh annual meetings in Morocco. We're also working with the Fight Inequality campaign in many issues. So join, look at the activities, and join us. Everybody's welcome. So you have the publications here, and thank you. I hope to see you at the campaign. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. I think you almost forced us to swim in such a deep sea of wisdom and knowledge around the issues of austerity and social protection. I'm not sure how much we can sort of process these information and these knowledge at this critical moment, but we'll definitely, I think we really need to understand this kind of very wider perspective. You gave us the whole framework of 9 measures to, kind of alternative austerity, and also, kind of very clear campaign and action. I think as a social justice cluster, we'll definitely like to, collaborate and understand, and also, encourage and motivate other partners and friends, to be part of this campaign and become a co-traveler along with all of you. So thank you so much for presenting this and giving us the great opportunity to understand this larger debate, which we all should understand and take it forward. And of course, I think campaign is a is coming up on the great time. And I think we need to really understand that how we can strengthen this campaign in Asia and Europe and beyond. So I think stay tuned.
Chandran, if may I add, I mean, the
yes,
reason why we're going through the alternatives,
yes,
it is because governments say, and the IMF say, that there are no alternatives.
Yeah,
they are.
Yeah,
and that's why we're saying them. And generally, austerity is imposed with this idea that no alternatives are there. That's why. Thank you.
So I think excellent for proposing a number of alternatives, not only one. I think there's so many. I think it's a really eye-opening for all of us. But stay tuned, ma'am. I think there will be some questions. But let me quickly go to our next speakers. I mean, people like us have learned about debate of social security and social protection in India, largely from him, and he has worked so intensively on this subject. But please allow me to introduce him. Ravi Srivastavaji is a currently director, Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, Delhi. He was earlier professor of economics and chairperson at Center for the Study of Regional Development, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and full-timer member of the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector in the rank of the Secretary of the Government of India. Just for the information for others, because of this report, the first unorganized worker social security law enacted in India. So credit goes to Ravi sir for this. So Ravi sir, floor is yours, please sir.
Thank you, Chandan. Thank you, Chandan and Francine, for inviting me. And thanks to Isabel, to Farooq Bhai, and to Rexon for their words. I maybe refer to some of what they had said in my very brief presentation and notes. I'm not going to use a PowerPoint. In 10 minutes, it's better to summarize what I want to say than use a PowerPoint. Just to begin by saying that I think in developing countries, one does basically redistributive policies need to underpin universal social protection. And when I say redistributive policies, I mean, I want to interpret this quite broadly. Redistribution in assets, including land, have been a very big source of social protection in countries like ours. Income redistribution, which also means, looking at taxes, looking at the fiscal system as a whole, and of course, reallocation of fiscal expenditures. So I think redistribution is quite the key to looking at social protection. Along with this, of course, social protection should not be looked at in isolation. One has to look at it within the framework of macroeconomic policies and equitable growth. Very often we see it in a segmented way, but policies which simultaneously are increasing inequality and immiserizing people can do a lot to negate social protection programs and policies or the impact of these on people. And this is something we need to be aware of. I'm going to very briefly summarize for you the evolution of, I will take you back, in fact, almost about 3 decades, to look at the evolution of social protection policies and programs in India. And just to give you a gist of the present scenario, and then to look at the options involved. So basically, as most of you know, we started economic reforms, conventional economic reforms, mainstream economic reforms in 91 in India, which is basically a package of measures to bring about liberalization and to integrate the Indian economy with the global economy. And in the beginning, the country followed a very, very orthodox fiscal policy. Fiscal consolidation was very paramount. But from the mid-90s, I think the government moved over to what I may call a somewhat more heterodox neoliberal policy, set of neoliberal policies. And I think the way our democracy works out had a lot to do with it, along with, of course, the role of social movements. So we saw very fledgling kind of moves towards some social protection programs in the 90s. But then on, the social protection movements in the country took very firm ground. And they were around a whole host of issues, beginning with the right to education, the right to information, the right to health, the right to food. And this was basically along with a strong section within the then government, which was responsive to the demands of the social movement. So there was a process of negotiation between the social movements and the more progressive sections of government, and the more progressive sections of government and the more neoliberal stands of government, including the then Prime Minister, this thing. And then this led to several important legislative pieces in the country. The right to education came first. I mean, we introduced education up to the elementary level as a fundamental right. Then we had the right to information, which was a very important, pillar of the social movements and their right to extract information from governments. Then we had the right to, a very limited right to employment, to public employment in rural areas, which is known as the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Program, which many of you would know. And then finally, in 2013, we had the National Food Security Act, which was basically to enable 2/3 of the Indian population to receive subsidized food grain, and therefore to ensure food security. And these were really very important pillars, which happened roughly between 2002 and 2013. 13 was about the same. And this happened against a very strong, the mainstream governance model, the economic governance model in the country continued to accelerate labor market flexibility, continued on a model of growth which was simultaneously increasing inequalities, so polarizing incomes and so on. But at the same time, there was an increase in real social protection expenditures, and also as a percentage, a small growth in social protection expenditures as a percentage of income. At the level of the federal government, if you exclude food security, then it was roughly only about 1% of GDP, which is not much. But this had increased from just over 0.5% of GDP in about a decade and a half, just over. But then from about 12-13 onwards, as the impact of the stimulus which was given after the financial crisis started withering out and the sources of growth started petering out in the Indian economy, there was a tightening. And in the last government itself, we saw more orthodox policies, fiscal policies being followed, and a cutback in social protection expenditures. And the new government, which came into existence in 2014, throughout has followed a very, very orthodox fiscal policy, targeting what in India we know as the fiscal resource, the FRBM Act and the rules, which basically limit the amount of fiscal deficit which the country can have through a central act. Not only this, the government, the Prime Minister and the government declared they avowed this thing to cut back on social protection expenditures, saying that basically they called them crutches. So they said that the poor don't need crutches, and there was a need to cut them back. The emphasis came on contributory social security schemes for the poor, which were in effect unworkable in the Indian situation because of a degree of informality And as Rexon pointed out, because in many cases, there is no employer-employee relationship at all in the Indian case. But from 1819, we see social and political populism taking shape before the elections which took place in 2019. And the government which was talking about doubling farmers' income between 2014-15 and 2021-22, introduced a farmer support scheme. And then during COVID and after COVID, it expanded the food security scheme by giving free rations. Again, paradoxically, the same government claims that it has remarkable successes in reducing poverty. But having had those remarkable successes, it felt compelled to increase the level of food subsidy in the country. And it created a new class, a new political class, which it called the beneficiary class. In recent elections, the beneficiary class, it says, has become a major support base for the new government. So this government has moved away from rights-based social protection entitlements to social entitlements which basically follow its own populist schemes, while still not eschewing, this thing for fiscal orthodoxy and so on. And in fact, if you exclude food security schemes, what you find is that in the last decade, the percentage of federal expenditure on social protection has fallen from about 1.35% of GDP to just over 1% of GDP. So there has been a fall in the percentage allocated to social protection expenditures along with this. So the point here is that many of us, and I would like to say that already you, Isabel, pointed out what social protection could comprise. I'm not going into the list. Many of us have tried to do fiscal exercises of what it would take to provide a minimum level of social protection expenditure, which includes old age pensions, which includes health and so on. At a reasonable, India spends just about 1.2 to 1.4% of its public expenditure on health. It only spends about 0.08% of GDP on old age pensions, which, as we've seen in the Latin American case, can be strongly redistributed. And we feel that at the very minimum, at the basic level, and this is in consultation with the kind of benchmarks which have been developed through social movements, roughly about 4 to 5% of GDP can actually achieve at least a basic minimum. And then we can look at contributory add-ons, the kind of staircase which ILO talks on, but this basic minimum will really be a non-contributory, expenditure, I'll say. Now, if you look at the tax GDP ratio in India, changes have taken place, but the tax GDP ratio has roughly been constant between 15.5% roughly 16.5% of GDP for the center and the states combined. There have been a lot of giveaways. A giveaway in terms of basically non-performing assets of banks to the corporate classes. There have been giveaway in terms of corporate tax rebates. So roughly about $20 billion was given away in terms of tax rebates just before the COVID hit us in India. So these large corporate giveaways have, and also a regime which is very permissive towards the highly profitable sectors, whether it is, for example, whether it is the digital, the IT sector, or whether it is the newly emerging sector, the so-called startups, digital startups, and so on. So it's a very a liberal tax regime towards them. In fact, free taxes, no taxes levied on a very large number of sectors. So that this has accompanied a very rapid growth of the large corporates in India, funneling a very rapid increase in inequality at one end, a decline in the informal sector at the other end. So there has been, both in the production sense, there has been an increase in inequality, but also in a wealth sense and in an income sense, a very rapid increase in inequality throughout this period. There has been an estimate given by a former chief economic advisor, which says that if you compare India to the benchmark in other developing countries, comparable developing countries, then taxes could easily be increased by about 5.6% of GDP from the present level. And these figures were not given by social movements or economists which are of a persuasion very different from government. They came from the government itself, from the chief economic advisor. Of course, they were questioned in an article by Surjit Bhalla, whom Isabel and many of you may know, who was recently India's nominees on the World Bank Executive Board and a former employee of the World Bank. who said actually India, who says that India is overtaxed by 1% of GDP, given comparable levels, and uses IMF global data to try and show it. Mr. Bhalla has outrageously claimed that made outrageous claims also on poverty, on wages, and so on in the recent past. So I don't want to go into those debates. So there is fiscal space. And there's also fiscal space if you consider the fact, as I think Francine pointed out, that a lot of this space is being preempted by defense expenditures, by various other expenditures, which certainly the government can cut down upon if they prioritize social expenditure. So, various colleagues of ours, for example, for India, Professor Jayati Ghosh has pointed out that a 1% tax on the super rich can bring enormous amounts of additional resources. There is a question of inheritance tax and wealth tax, which you also talk about and various others have talked about. And of course, there are the giveaways, constant giveaways to the corporate sectors, which can be plugged to bring more resources. Social security in India and social protection is for the informal sector, which is 92% of the workforce. And these workers benefit not only the corporates, not only the formal sector, but they also benefit the middle classes in India. So many of us have argued that actually there is scope for a tax surcharge on all income taxpayers, because the informal workers actually everybody benefits from the labor of the informal workers who receive no social security. So I think the idea that social security is unaffordable in the way that Isabel has talked about it, or the way that many of us have talked about in India, is a non-starter. This has to be on the basis of stakeholder dialogue, as has correctly been pointed out. But I must point out that India is also going through a phase where social movements are being suppressed. Finances to social movements are being suppressed, right? Dissent, critiques of government are being seen as dissent, not only the critiques of the government, but also being seen as anti-patriotic and anti-national. And even Indians living abroad who have, for example, certain privileges in India when they travel to India, they don't need a visa and so on, find that these privileges have been cancelled without even notices to them, just simply because they critique the government. So the present government has no faith in social movement, doesn't believe in social dialogue. There has not been an Indian Labour Conference, actually, in the 9 years of this government, which is a body which Isabel knows well, where the government and the employers and the workers sit together and they will deliberate on various issues concerning labor. There's not been one since ILC since 2015. So there is an issue of how do you ground the social movement, prioritize the government, which is believing in neoconservative policies and in not only economic policies, but neoconservative social policies also. How do you actually bring this kind of a government to think about the kind of reforms that we're hoping to talk about? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ravi sir. I think you've given a lot of ideas to, I think, Isabel, how to ground the campaign, how to take forward the campaign to the social movement, and how can start with building it up on the ground. But just one question, I think, is also, the previous speakers also spoke about that. The degradation of workers' identity, starting from a worker, then / citizen, I would say that, then goes to beneficiaries. Now, under the garb of the digital capitalism, the platform economy, now you're being called as a partners, et cetera, et cetera. So, how workers will fight it out? How will workers, even though there is a whole reduction of, GDP contribution, and yet there is not much political demand, I would say that, as far as the, larger political demand and struggle and resistance for social protection. So how do you also see that? And how, if we can take forward this campaign, austerity campaign, to the people, then what kind of response we will receive and get it? I think these are kind of questions I would definitely like to put it on there. But just very, very quickly, I think we have one respondents. And then after, I think we can open the floor for the questions. Sastro, if you're there, let me just quickly introduce our colleague Sastro. He's an IOC member of APF and represent APF Indonesia. He's the head of KPRI, the Confederation of Indonesian People's Movement.
Hello.
Yes, it's an umbrella organization in Indonesia consisting of working people who are among the members of union and the people's organizations. So, Sastro, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for the. I think it's very important our discussion. Sorry, I'm on the way.
Yeah.
Like in Indonesia, I think Rexon is already presentation about the BPJS and also the access to the social protection. Sorry, are you hear me?
Yes, yes, please go ahead. Yes,
okay.
Please.
Yeah, I think we have many problems about the social protection. I think not only in Indonesia, because we still for example, focus on the formal worker, for example. In Indonesia, informal worker is very big, more than 60%, for example. And very difficult to access to the like of the healthcare, like of the BPJS for all of the BPJS, and so to education. And now the condition in Indonesia, our problem is corruption for the fund of the social protection. This is many social assistant, but how to the like of the security and the protection is very limit. And so the politician and bureaucrat, they using of the program of the social protection to buy the, for example, is in the election processing in Indonesia. This is our problem. For example, is many minister in Indonesia is come from political party. This is not from, for example, is the practitioner and how the people is now about the social protection, for example. This is our problem. And I think it's very important to us how to make up the social protection basic material in formal education. I think is for the formal education, I think it's very important. We must know and like of the socialization to the children in the school, how about social protection. Why? This is important because not many people know about what is social protection, for example. And often then very difficult to access social protection. And the second, I think also important, how to make up the social protection basic right. And this one is our proposal, which to the every country must be comply with the implementation. And because we have many concept, many idea how to the social protection for the universal social protection and so transformative social protection, we can push not only to the politician, not only to the government, but to the people. I think this is important. Thank you.
Thank you, Sastro. So I think we have a couple of questions also in the chat box, but I think it would be great if any attendees want to speak directly. Maria Cristina, you want to speak directly? Instead of writing in the Q&A, you can go ahead and speak.
All right.
Yeah,
Thank
please
you.
go.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, ma'am. Yeah.
Thank you. I am from the Philippines. I have two questions. One is for Isabel Ortiz. You mentioned that Timor-Leste engaged in a sovereign investment fund. May I know what year this was? And was this investment surplus of the government, which was used for investment? And what were the results, please? Because in the Philippines, we have a debate on the, the investment fund, which our president is proposing. And we find that the economists have mentioned that if it is not a surplus, then it is too risky for the country. Yeah. So that's the first question.
And Maria, you also have a question for Ravi. Please go ahead.
Yes, I have a question for Ravi Srivastava. Could you kindly elaborate on the beneficiary class that you mentioned created in India? Because I became curious what this beneficiary class, is it a positive or a negative thing? Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Is there any more question?
So far, that's it. So far, that's it.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll also take maybe a couple of more questions. I also have sent it to me instead of putting in the Q&A section. The question for Isabel and also for Ravi, for both of them. How do you see the package recently approved by the IMF for the Pakistan, the $3 billion? Do you see there's any hope of strengthening the economic program in Pakistan? That's a question I have. And another question is that the whole debate of austerity, how do we see that the social movement can take it forward, particularly in building the political alliances and bring state on the bargaining table? Yeah. So these are 2-3 questions I have directly received. So it's directed to all the speakers. Go ahead, please. Yeah, you can respond. Yeah. Isabel, you want to start? Or,
okay, yeah. Thank you. I was waiting for you to give me the word.
No, sorry, ma'am.
Okay, so there are a number of questions, very, very good questions. So I'm going to start by the one of the sovereign wealth funds. Yes, in Timor-Leste, and I just check it very quickly while you were asking the question. The Timor-Leste Petroleum Fund was installed in 2005 at a time that the country had really dismal human development indicators. If you look at the Human Development Report, Timor-Leste at the time was at the very bottom. And the problem that the sovereign wealth funds put is what is more worth. See, the reason where the sovereign wealth funds are done is to say this money that is, yes, this was funds coming from petroleum extraction, from oil extraction. Then they are put into capital markets overseas. So they will provide some future continued revenues. So if you have this amount of funds, then you put it and you receive every year a small amount, but constant of revenues. Some countries like Papua New Guinea, they wanted to finance education with that, for instance, also has another fund, but many countries do have, Iraq, Malaysia, many others. Okay, so the question is that legitimate? Because at the time where this happened, actually the Timorese were so poor, they were living in dismal conditions. So why to put these funds into the international, the stock exchange markets in London, Frankfurt, New York, Tokyo, when you could actually invest it in the Timorese today? So the United Nations in general has a position to prefer today, because today matters for the life of many, for people suffering. For people, for places you have a large amount of poor and destitute, you do need to focus today, because that might make the difference between the life and death of many people. Okay, a lot of human suffering. So that is there. In wealthier countries may be different, and then you might aim for that for stabilization purposes, but still it puts the issue why national savings from people in a country have to be invested in the financial sector overseas. That is a very legitimate development question. So I will frankly remain skeptical of sovereign wealth funds as an instrument. And then I wanted to go back to a very interesting comment done by Sastro. Actually, he was talking about political capture of social protection benefits in Indonesia. And that is actually a very, very relevant issue in many countries. And I wanted to explain some positive examples. For instance, in Mexico, where we found the same, the former Oportunidades or Progresa program was actually captured by many mayors, by many politicians. So that can be fought, but with a very strong national campaign, as they did, to say that that was linked to any party. even if you were to collect the benefits at a local level, you were actually told verbally, and there were many posters all over. This does not belong to any mayor. It's delinked politically. And I think we should go farther. And as Sastro was saying himself, the reality is that social protection is a human right. And that's why people should receive it. But meaning this can be combated, and you don't have to accept this is that social protection only look at the negative. There are positive examples of how to fight political capture by politicians. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Ravi sir?
Well, I think my question has partly been answered by Isabel, this question, because essentially social protection, I'm sure Maria, you would agree, has to be seen as a human right. And it has to be seen also as a legislated right. Otherwise it doesn't work. But political parties would like them to dole out social protection in the form of schemes, which are not legislated, which are not in the form of rights. And in India, they prefer to do it on the eve of elections, just before elections happen, so that there can be a large number of people whom they can go out and say, well, this is a benefit that we've created for you. And as I told you before, there were elections in a very large state in India in 2022, the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is the largest state. It would have been the 6th largest country in the world had it been an independent country. And now there, just before that elections, the government extended the food subsidy scheme by giving 5 kilograms of per capita of ration of food grains free to every individual, about 2/3 of individuals in that state. And it won that elections, and it claimed that it had won that election because there was this political class which had been created called the beneficiary class, which had voted for it. So this is actually very much linked to the question of political capture. Political capture can happen at local levels. It can also happen at national levels or at state levels, where governments use state finances to further political ends by floating schemes, which may sometimes not even be rational schemes. Okay, so I just linked this to the answer given by Isabel herself.
And just one additional question for you, Professor Srivastava. Currently in India, there is a debate around freebies versus development. Some government argues that the freebies are social protection for the poor. How can we see and differentiate between freebies and social protection? So if you can also talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is essentially anything which increases, I mean, in India to begin with, the mainstream economists see every social protection expenditure as a freebie. So let's begin from there, right? I mean, they see all giveaways to the corporate sector as necessary for growth and investment, and every social protection expenditure is seen as a freebie. In other words, I mean, the classic example was when the Employment Guarantee Act was enacted. A large number of economists actually wrote articles saying that this is like dropping money from helicopters to poor people, whereas the Employment Guarantee Act is a public works program. Actually, people work to create assets and receive wages. So, in fact, it is quite the contrary of any of this. But any social protection measure which increases the productivity of workers, which increases their health, nutrition, their basic functionings, as Amartya Sen would call it, should be seen as a valid social protection measure. But the broad classes of those measures are something which Isabel talked about, we should certainly aim at this first. Now, I'll give you two examples of what we could call freebies, and where we can draw the line or not draw the line, which become fuzzy. For example, the state of Tamil Nadu giving gold necklaces and televisions, color televisions, to its women. Now, I would call that in the nature of a freebie, not something which validly increases their, which I would not count this as social protection expenditure. But on the other hand, an innovative scheme in many of the northern states has been to give bicycles to young girls who are unable to access schools in rural areas because of the distance involved. And actually, this is a very unconventional measure, but this has actually accelerated enrollment in middle schools and in high schools for girls in many states in India. So I would call this a valid social protection measure. But I would say that, first of all, we should be looking at legislated schemes, and we should first cover the basic dimensions which many of us have talked about and Isabel listed in the presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ravi sir. Before I go to Tina for kind of concluding remarks, comments, I request Rexon Silaban if he has anything to add what Isabel and Ravi Srivastava has spoken. Yeah, Rexon.
Yes, first I'd like to Isabel, and I like the proposal of the austerity alternative, but you're not touched upon about the needed of the re-regulating or adjusting social protection to the new adaptive model, because social security model we have now, or not only Indonesia, in all over the world, is inherited from the past experience when there is no ecological issue, there is no cyber security issue, and then will be with this all system we cannot cover all universal social coverage protection. For instance, Indonesia will raise to the renewable energy, will cutting all phase out coal mining and other electricity, who is the fossil, come from fossil energy. And then also there is the incoming of the digital platform workers is not really suitable to the social security or social protection model existing right now. So what do you think about that? Because for my opinion, without changing existing social protection, both in the benefit and the scheme, we will not reach the social protection universally. And but other your proposition about taxing or formalizing, I like the idea. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Rexon. Isabel, you want to respond quickly to Rexon? Yeah.
Yes, I did agree so much with Rexon that I did not even mention anything. And I thought here generally we are all for a social protection floor, that it will be, for all those persons in need, from, persons with disability, older persons, mothers, children, etc. And, trying to cover all the population that needs it, and then go for the higher levels, we will think of a contributory system, like Rexon was saying. Now, this is going to take years. We know that, but it is evolving, and it's evolving very well in many places. So there are all reasons to keep moving forward, and I did agree with him. So that's the reason why I did not address it. I actually thought that all these groups generally asked for universal social protection. I heard so many strong statements by many members here that, and I keep retweeting them, that it's great to see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Isabel. Ravi sir, you want to respond to Rexon quickly?
No. We agree with that.
Okay. So I finally invite my colleague Tina to give a concluding remarks and also overall comment. Tina, I think, was the APF coordinator for Asia for many years. She worked with the Bread for the World and coordinated a Euro-wide project for refugee participation and human asylum policies. She convened human rights platform under the Marcos dictatorship, and which is not written here. Tina is also one of the prime mover and pusher in the APF social justice cluster. She keeps moving us and pushing us. So Tina, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Well, our many thanks to our excellent speakers, and to Isabel. We express our heartfelt gratitude on behalf of APF and its partners pursuing transformative social protection in Asia. Your writings, especially the UN book combating poverty and inequality, which contains your significant studies and recommendations. It served as some kind of a Bible for us who advocate social protection that is universal, comprehensive, legislation enhanced, state-driven, and with mechanisms for people's control. And in addition, financing this with a global fund, and of course, strengthening the national tax system, especially wealth taxes vis-a-vis the billionaires, the cancellation of illegitimate debt, and the drastic reduction of military budgets. We are very fortunate that the International Peace Bureau, which is leading this campaign to slash military budgets for human needs, is also an active and a leading, coordinating even the AEPF Peace and Security Cluster. So we will be working with them very closely. I want to say that years before the pandemic, AEPF organized several conferences on social protection, and we were able to address the heads of states and presented these urgent demands at ASEAN meetings and also at the ASEAN meetings. And we pressed world leaders to end neoliberal policies, including the large-scale privatization or commercialization of essential services and resources, as these policies have devastated indeed the lives of millions and prevented people from their full development as human beings. I come from a Catholic country, you know, so I want to say that it is Pope Francis, perhaps one of the few world leaders who agree with us wholeheartedly. He has the courage to censure unbridled capitalism and the greed of transnational corporations. And for him, social protection, like us, covers work guarantee and livable wages, free and decent health care, education up to the tertiary level, housing for every family, and living pensions for all. Not only the seniors and the PWDs, but also housewives. And for Pope Francis, the realization of universal social protection is an ethical and moral responsibility. Yesterday, I read Bloomberg's report that 47% of the world's population barely survive on $6.25 a day, while the world's richest people added $850 billion to their fortunes in the first half of 2023. So in these times of illegal poverty and inequality and a climate emergency, how can we proceed to campaign with greater political will and audacity? A few days ago, recently, I was able to confer with civil society figures in Asia, Walden Bello, Farouk, who was here in Manila, and also Charles Santiago. They are so keen to invigorate a campaign in Asia to end austerity and to finance jobs and social protection for all. Hence, the concrete proposal from APF to hold end security conferences, particularly in South Asia, if possible in Pakistan, where the economy is forecasted to collapse this year, maybe with 10 other countries in the global south. And also a conference in Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur in the ASEAN with the ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights. We believe that these conferences could generate the active cooperation of fighting communities at the national level with fighting movements at the regional and global level, and with fighting parliamentarians and world leaders. As our campaigns require indeed the building of a critical mass and critical pressure from below that can put in place at the center people's alternatives for a humane, just, and sustainable world. So we hope these conferences could be supported by Isabel and Joseph Stiglitz, and by the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, who was our speaker last month, and by top experts in the EU on fundamental rights. These top and independent experts is coordinated by Professor Olivier de Schutter, the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty. So thank you very much, Isabel, and our two wonderful speakers. We thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
I think Tina has summed up very well and also shown kind of expressed the clear appetite of APF to be part of and building and co-curating this campaign. Farooq bhai, do you want to say any last word before I close it? Yeah.
Okay, Tina, thank you very much. We had a very good meeting at Manila last week with Walden Bello, and he was very keen to work together, particularly when I explained the situation of Pakistan at present time, where Pakistan is almost collapsing, and there is a lot of repression going on instead of putting up some alternative. Alongside with the climate disaster, it's now economic disaster because of the extreme conditionalities put by IMF for a 3 billion loan to Pakistan. And that has made the life of Pakistan very miserable. I have never seen in my life the price hike that is taking place in Pakistan and the austerity the government has taken in the public sector particularly. So, Tina, I wholeheartedly second your opinions, and we look forward to work with Isabel, with Raviji, with all other speakers. And I think this was, thank you, Chandan and Francine and Hossein for organizing this event.
Thank you. I think it's time to closing, but on that note that, as Farooq bhai and Tina said, that Isabel will touch base very soon also with all the other two speakers, Ravi sir, Sastro, Rexon, that how to move forward and build a campaign on austerity. So thank you so much for joining in. We'll touch base very soon with the report and also the recording of this program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, really.